Moving on. After introducing the notion of theme as a choice of what you place at the beginning of a unit to give it a certain prominence, a prominence as the orientation to the remainder of that unit, or the starting point for your listeners, your readers, as they process the meanings of that unit, we'll now raise the question of the selection of theme. And in answering the question of what it can be selected as theme, we'll also come to the question of how far does theme extend into the clause. This then is lecture 3, segment 3. Let's return to the folktale. We've already seen that each paragraph within the macro theme, so really the first 2 paragraphs, were significant in terms of the thematic considerations. Then we see the break from the placement, if you look at the top row, situation, recreating, narrating, placement, to the episodic sequence within the narrative, the initiating event. If we follow the selections clause by clause, we get this. Pyramids, palaces, and temples of stone, but that referring back to them standing silently. Long, long ago, in one of those cities whose name has long been forgotten, since he, referring back to the old Halaguni, he, that his younger brother, Chiruma, that's part of the same theme, but the chief's wife, each day, and then one day. This is where the break occurs. So there is from the placement to the initiating event within the sequence of episodes. So we can look at the progression, and right at the end of paragraph 2, we get each day, da-da-da-da, and then in the next paragraph, and one day. In this clause, one day her prayers were answered, the theme is and one day. It indicates there's a relation and then a change of time from each day to one day. So we've met a characterization of what the habits of the royal family were. Chief and his wife, she prayed, was a habit of praying, and then a change from each day to one day. That's a matter of thematic progression. So reading a text, listening to a text, clause by clause, theme by theme, we get through the theme selections an indication of how the text progresses. That's one view then of a clause. Clause is message in a progression of messages as the text unfolds. This clause then, and one day her prayers were answered, is the clause as a message, quantum information, and part of the progression through the text. From the point of view of the textual metafunction, the clause then functions in the text as a message, a quantum of information, and it is one of the messages that make up the thematic progression of the text. In other words, the speaker or writer organizes the sequence of messages in such a way as to create a flow or progression of information through the thematic choices. This clause, and one day her answers were prayed, and one day her prayers were answered, can thus be analyzed textually as a message, a quantum information, as part of the progression. Interpersonally as a move, either proposition or proposal, in this case a proposition, giving information, a quantum of interaction with the speech function of a statement. And finally, figure, a quantum of change in the flow of events, the first in the episodes that follow in the narrative. But now we're looking at it as a message, and we're paying attention to the choice of that part of the message that is given the status of theme. We can thus ask about the selection of themes. In this case, one day. So one day her prayers were answered. But we can look at alternatives. We can look at other candidates. And immediately examining one day her prayers were answered, we can see, well, there would be an alternative. Her prayers were answered one day. So let's look at the alternatives. In the thematic structure of the clause, this example, and I left out and now, the theme is one day, and the rheme is her prayers were answered. What's the rheme? The rheme is a non-theme. The rheme is what is developed against the background of the orientation of the point of departure of the clause as a message. In this case, the theme is a normal group, one day, and the rheme a sequence of a normal group and a verbal group. The normal group is her prayers, and the verbal group were answered. But there is always a choice. So part of the significance of the theme is precisely that it is chosen against other alternatives. What are the alternative options? Well, her prayers were answered one day. In other words, instead of putting one day, the representation of time at the beginning, we could start with her prayers. So in this alternative version, her prayers serves a theme, the normal group, and the rheme is a verbal group followed by a normal group, were answered one day. Now I remember we had some discussion of the subject and the nature of the subject. And we talked about the way in which you can recognize a theme by checking what's placed at the beginning of the clause, what comes first in the clause. But in the case of subject, we said you recognize a subject in English. You can identify the subject by checking, is it the element, or which element is picked up in a question tag. So her prayers were answered one day, weren't they? One day her prayers were answered, weren't they? In other words, the subject is the same in these two versions. What changes is the choice of theme. One day her prayers were answered, theme one day. Her prayers were answered one day, theme her prayers. Consequently, in the second version, the subject is also the theme, and we'll come back to this. In the first version, the one that actually occurs in the folktale, it's something other than the subject, an adjunct or adverbial of time, one day. And we've already seen that that is in fact motivated in terms of the progression, thematic progression in the text. Each day, then one day. By placing one day at the beginning of the clause, the narrator, the storyteller, signals, makes prominent the shift in time from each day, the habit, to one particular day, one day. The first episode of the narrative. Similarly, to take another example from the same text, she gave birth to a son, didn't she? Here the theme is also the subject, the normal group, she, and the rheme is verbal group, normal group, prepositional phrase, gave birth to a son. Again, we can test the subject by adding a question tag. She gave birth to a son, didn't she? So we know that she is also the subject in addition to being the theme. But again, we can have an alternative. There's a choice. There's another option. To a son, she gave birth one day. That means taking as a point of departure, giving as an orientation to a son. It might be contrastive. To son she gave birth to son she gave birth, not to a daughter. But the point is that there is a contrast between she gave birth to a son and to a son she gave birth. Here is another pair. Again, starting with the version that actually appears in the text so that we can reason about it and we can ask, why did the writer choose, or the storyteller choose to make this the theme? The child. The child was born on the 13th day of the month. The theme is the nominal group, the child, and the rheme was born on the 13th day of the month. Verbal group, prepositional phrase. Again, we can check which is the subject, adding a question tag. And the result is the child was born on the 13th day, wasn't it? In other words, the child is the subject, and so in this case, the theme is the subject. But there is an alternative. We could choose something else. And think for a second, what's the alternative? What could you choose to give the status of theme other than the child? The nominal group, the child. Yes, you're all right. On the 13th day of the month, the child was born. It's exactly the same as far as the clause as the move is concerned, a proposition. On the 13th day of the 13th day of the month, the child was born, wasn't it? The subject is still the child. However, it has now been displaced as theme, as it were, pushed away from the status of theme by the prepositional phrase indicating a time on the 13th day of the month. So the theme is the prepositional phrase on the 13th day of the month, and the rheme, nominal group followed by verbal group, the child was born. As always, you can go on to say, well, what would inform the choice? In this case, in terms of the thematic progression, it makes sense to give the child the status of theme. But if the text at this point had been going through a little sequence of times, the first day of the month, the second day of the month, the 13th day of the month, then this might have been motivated as the choice of theme. In other words, if there was a local chronological method of development, a temporal progression at this point. We could, in fact, construct a whole alternative paragraph. So the original paragraph is, and on the 13th day, and one day her prayers were answered. She gave birth to a son. The child was born on the 13th day of the month, a lucky day, for the number reminded the Mayan people of their 13 heavens. So we can manipulate this. We could doctor it. We could edit it. And here is an edited version where we made other thematic choices. And her prayers were answered one day. To a son she gave birth. On the 13th day of the month, a lucky day, the child was born. For of the 13 heavens, the number reminded the Mayan people. Now each choice here, each alternative choice, and her prayers were answered one day instead of, and one day her prayers were answered, is possible. They're all candidates for the status of theme. But if you consider it now in its environment, if you look at it ecologically, as it were, in the progression of choices in the text as it unfolds, you can see that our edited version is not very good. The thematic choices are not well motivated, and we're always expecting themes to be motivated, to contribute to the progression, to contribute to the method of development. And this is, of course, one thing you can do in looking at your own text. As you produce them, you review them, you edit them, and one of the things to pay attention to is precisely how you've managed the flow of information in the text. Something there's good reason to come back to. Again, notice the example we've been looking at. And one day her prayers were answered. The motivation behind the choice of one day is precisely that it shifts the progression from each day, from the habitual occurrences, to the first event in the episodic sequence. In other words, the transition from placement to initiating event. Last week, in lecture 2, we talked about the question of how you recognize theme. And I said, in the case of theme, you recognize it in terms of its sequence, in terms of its position. It's put first in the clause. So by being put first, it's made prominent. It's made prominent as theme. Now its function is to give an orientation, to contextualize the clause relative to where the clause occurs. Or, as I put it, to serve as a guide from the speaker, the writer, to tell the reader, to tell the listener, this is where you start your interpretation of the clause. In other words, the starting point of the clause. But the realization is first position. And we have to keep these separate. Its function, its significance, and how you realize it, how you recognize it, how you identify it. In other words, theme, function, orientation to, or point of departure from, the discursive environment. So it simply means the environment of text or discourse that the clause as a message emerges from, textually, interpersonally, and experientially. And we distinguish this from the realization, the way it's marked, the way it's signaled, the way it's coded, namely by first position in the clause. Now, the way I put it, the theme functions as an orientation to the discursive environment of the clause as a message. And then going on to indicate that the discursive environment, its environment in the discourse, in the text, is textual, is interpersonal, experiential. That suggests, in fact, that we could have more than one kind of theme from a functional point of view. And that's exactly the case in English. So to recap, a clause operates in the text environment as, one, a message. And as a message, it has a textual theme relating to other messages. So its textual development marked by conjunctions may be given the status of theme. Like and in our example, and one day her prayers were answered. Or afterwards, her prayers were answered. Or nevertheless, her prayers were answered. In other words, her prayers were answered. Furthermore, her prayers were answered. All these conjunctions indicate the relationship to previous messages. At the same time, the clauses also move, and as such, it may have an interpersonal theme, its interpersonal status in the exchange. If it had been, for example, happily her prayers were answered, or happily one day her prayers were answered, happily would be interpersonal theme. And it would be the storyteller saying, my angle on the information I'm about to give you is desirable, is positive. Happily, one day her prayers were answered, as opposed to unfortunately one day her prayers were answered, or predictably, or surprisingly. And at the same time, as we've already seen, the clause is a figure, a configuration that represents a quantum of change in the flow of events, and as such, it has a topical theme. Some part of the figure, some part of the configuration of process, participants, and circumstances. So some aspect of its representation may be given the status of theme, a participant, a circumstance, or a process. Maximally then, a theme in English can include a textual theme, an interpersonal theme, and a topical theme. It always has to include a topical theme, and it may also include a textual theme and or an interpersonal theme. So we can now begin to raise and answer the question, how far does the theme extend? And that means how far does it extend into the clause? Or in other words, how far does the theme extend and when does the rheme take over? And the principle is this. The theme of a clause extends up to the first element that has a function transitivity. Up to in the sense of up to and including the first element that has function transitivity. And let me quote one of the readings that you have in your e-library, a good introduction overview to the grammar when you're interested in using the description of the grammar to do discourse analysis from the point of view of grammar. So Halliday's Dimensions of Discourse Analysis Grammar. It goes like this. The theme is the speaker's point of departure for the clause. That's its function, its definition. The theme is the speaker's point of departure for the clause. It is realized in English by position in the sequence. Thematic elements are put first. Hence the thematic structure of the clause is theme followed by rheme. That little hatchet to up arrow means simply followed by, order before. Theme before rheme. Each of the three metafunctional components of the content plane, ideational, including experiential and logical, ideational, interpersonal and textual, may contribute thematic material. The textual theme is some combination of continuative, typically in dialogue, oh, well, yes, no, conjunctive, then, if, or relative pronouns, that, which. The interpersonal theme is modality, perhaps, interrogative mood marker, like a WH. When were our prayers answered? Why were our prayers answered? How were our prayers answered? Or finite elements, finite verbal auxiliary. Were her prayers answered? Or vocative. My friend, her prayers were answered. The topical theme is any element functioning in the transitivity structure of the clause, so the experiential structure of the clause. The typical sequence is textual, followed by interpersonal, followed by topical theme. And the theme, in any case, ends with a topical element. In other words, the theme of the clause extends up to the first element that has a function in transitivity, whether it's a participant, a circumstance, or the process. We can represent this diagrammatically. In building up the theme is selected in such a way that it may relate to the discursive environment emerging from the previous discourse. Oh well, then if, nevertheless, and so on. And also possibly to the interpersonal environment, relation to the addressee. For example, frankly, one day her prayers were answered, meaning I'm being frank in telling you. And to the experiential environment. In the narrative, the episodic build-up of the story, orienting participants, circumstance, and process. So if we take this example, however, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn, which is actually a doctored example from one that occurs in a movie. The theme extends to and includes I. However, textual theme, frankly, my dear, interpersonal theme, and I, topical theme. Why I? Well, I is a participant in don't give. In this way, the clause is typically a move from theme, or the clause is a move from theme, typically to new information. The new information here is don't give a damn. We can represent this as three simultaneous choices. You always have to choose a topical theme. The question is whether it's a default one for the clause given its type, or a marked one. Unmarked or marked. We'll come back to this choice. Marked would be a damn I don't give. Possible, but certainly marked. In case of the textual theme, you have a choice. Will you or won't you include a textual theme? In this case, however, serves as textual theme. Similar in principle with the interpersonal theme, will you or won't you have an interpersonal theme? In this case, there are two parts to the interpersonal theme. Frankly, a comment adjunct, and my dear, evocative. So by the time you get to don't give a damn, you've had an orientation, a build-up of a local context that includes relation to what went before. However, my interaction with you, frankly, my dear, and then what I'm talking about, the topical theme, I. Now the original example is, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. And in the doctored version, I added, however. But let's have a look at the original example. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. This comes from the end of one of the very famous Hollywood films from the late 1930s. I'll play you the clip, and meanwhile you can guess. You may or may not have seen this film, you may or may not have heard of it, but as I said, it's very famous in the history of Hollywood films.
Fred, please don't say that. I'm so sorry. Please don't say that. I'm so sorry for everything. I'm so sorry for everything.
My darling, you're such a child.
You think that by saying I'm sorry,
all
you
the
think that by
past can
saying
be
I'm
corrected.
sorry,
All the past can be corrected.
yeah, take my handkerchief.
Yeah.
Never in any
Take my
crisis of
handkerchief.
your life have I known you to
Never
have a
in any
handkerchief.
crisis of your life have I known you to have a handkerchief.
Red, where are you going? Red,
Going to
Red,
Charles.
where are you going?
Back where I belong.
Please,
Going to
please
Charles.
take me with
Back
you.
where I belong.
Please take me with you.
I'm through with everything here.
No.
I'm through with everything here. I want to see if somewhere there isn't something left in life
I want
of
to see
charm
if
and
somewhere
grace.
there isn't something left in life of charm
You know what
and
I'm
grace.
talking about?
No, I only
You
know
know what
that
I'm
I
talking
love
about?
you. I only
your
know that I
misfortune.
love you.
That's your misfortune.
You go. Where shall I go? What shall I go? Where shall I go?
Frankly,
What shall
my
I
dear,
do?
I don't give a damn.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Have you recognized the film? Have you seen it before? Have you heard about it? Or is your memory of the film Gone with the Wind? Well, that's indeed the name of the film, Gone with the Wind, a film version from a well-known book at the time, late 30s. This is the end of lecture 3.3. Next, we'll turn to 3.4, and we'll focus on the central principle: the theme is selected according to method of development of a text. We've already seen this, a hint of this, where the text was a narrative and the method of development involved attention to time, a narrative unfolding in time, from each day to one day.